Hello and welcome to the best films of 2022. You may be asking yourself, hey, isn't it supposed to have come out in December where every other film YouTuber puts out their film reviews? And I'm like, no, I don't have to, it's my channel. Honestly, giving myself a few extra months after the last year gives me an opportunity to view films that I hadn't yet previously seen so that I may consider them for this video. And it did give me a lot of things to think about. And one of those things that I thought about was changing up the format of my videos. See, in previous years, it was basically like every other film YouTuber video, where it's a sort of top 10 list. Oh, this is what my top 10 list, this is my top 25, this is my top 30. And I get it, I get the whole thing of ranking them and whatnot, but honestly, I'm kind of tired of it. I'm tired of this sort of hierarchical, like, this is what I thought of the best film and, you know, making everyone else look considerably worse. To me, I view all of the films that I'm going to be mentioning today on an equal playing field. Every single one of them I could count as some of my favorite movies of the year, some of my favorite experiences of the year, and to be completely honest with you, I'm tired of this whole hierarchy of things where I have to place one in front of the other, and honestly it could just be any of them at any point. Like, I could have literally have had a tier list where I put Terrifier 2 as number 1, and it would have been a subjective list. Doesn't take away anything from it. And by the way, I'm not actually going to be putting Terrifier 2 at number 1 on any list, so that's just me. But no, this year we're going to be doing something a bit different. So unlike years past where I had a whole tier list, this year we're going to be putting films into different categories. And that is where we're going to have the most discussion. Each of the categories are going to be like things that relate to the year so that I can better contextualize what this year really brought to the table as opposed to just ranking them, which I find a little bit boring nowadays. But first things first, we have to do some honorable mentions. The first honorable mention I'm going to mention here is the Marvel Studios presentation films Werewolf by Night and Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special. Each of these really brought to the table, in terms of their respective franchise, the opportunity to showcase a story that's not really long enough to be, you know, a TV show, but too short to be an actual film. It's an opportunity for the MCU to kind of play around with different genres and different styles and different stories that otherwise probably would not have made for a big movie. Werewolf by Night was a really fun throwback to the black and white monster films that Michael Giacchino, film's biggest composer at the moment, his favorite films back then when he was a kid were monster films, and it made the most sense for him to tackle something like Werewolf by Night. And then with the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special, it's basically when Santa Claus gets kidnapped by Martians. In fact, they kind of call out that movie inside of this short film. I find both of these to be a pretty fun sort of, you know, exercise in, hey, this is just kind of a fun concept, things that probably would not have been a feature film anyway, but here, have some fun with it. And honestly, Werewolf by Night probably could make for an annual Halloween watch. I think that's a pretty fun little creature feature film. Next up on the honorable mention list is Weird, the Al Yankovic Story. Daniel Radcliffe does an amazing job playing this sort of like hyper like exaggerated version of Weird Al in a sort of like makeshift, this is a pseudo-serious sort of biopic sort of thing. Obviously the music is really funny considering the fact that it's just Weird Al Yankovic and Daniel Radcliffe's just kind of lip syncing. I thought it was pretty funny. It does kind of run counter to a lot of biopics that have been coming out recently, which is kind of nice, but I still think the best like musical biopic parody was Dewey Cox. I'm sorry, that's pretty funny. Getting into the more YouTube side of things, we have Bo Burnham's Inside Outtakes. I would consider this its own film, and yes, certainly this is just like a collage of different outtakes of things that would have been in the Bo Burnham Inside Special from 2020, but this honestly feels like its own thing. When you take into consideration all the outtakes and how it kind of complements and sort of contrasts with the original Inside, it gives a lot more context and a lot more understanding of the thought process behind the making of the film. And it was pretty fun to watch, honestly. There's a lot of cut songs that I would have been like, yeah, that could have been in there. And then there were some things that were like, oh, okay, well, I can understand why that didn't go in there. And the other thing on the YouTube side was In Space with Markiplier Parts 1 and 2. Now I know what you're thinking, but that's not a film. Sir, may I turn your attention to Bandersnatch for a minute? Bandersnatch on Netflix, which was a Black Mirror thing, was a similar thing to In Space with Markiplier, where it was a choose-your-own-adventure thing that was, this big, choose-your-own-adventure movie on Netflix, and Markiplier basically does the same thing, but in two separate halves. It's basically a story of you being a captain of the Invincible 2, and what I found the most interesting, the most intriguing out of this project was that Markiplier, or Mark Fishbach, and his production team have put so much effort into not only the set design and the differences in how to portray the different universes and timelines that are portrayed in the two-part special, but also just how much work narratively had to be done. Like, this whole thing of having to, chart out each decision is a lot of work from a writing standpoint. And considering the fact that Mark Fishbach himself, or Markiplier, is set to direct his first feature film soon, it's quite amazing to see how far he's come creatively with all this stuff from his narrative work. I'm kind of excited to see where Markiplier goes with his film career. Can't wait to see what happens. And then honorable mentions on the documentary side of things, we have a few of them. So the first one is In Search of Tomorrow. This is from the same people who did In Search of Darkness, and honestly, this is kind of the same sort of film as with In Search of Darkness, only this time it was 80s sci-fi and fantasy films. And honestly, not that bad of a documentary. A lot of films in that film that were talked about that I kind of found that I wanted to watch too. So I watched a few of them, and I'm kind of just going through the list of films that I could watch. It's pretty fine for a documentary, and I'm excited to see where the second one goes to in terms of the topics that are discussed. The second film to talk about is Pennywise, The Story of It. This was a documentary on Shudder that was a huge documentary about the making of the 90s television miniseries. And there's so much of it that kind of parallels things that happened to the remake. And there are some things that I found that were just really fun to think about as a film nerd and also as a general kind of fan of the original It. Everything from the fact that it was originally going to be 8 episodes to 2, and there's so many things that they describe behind the scenes that is just interesting to think about for the time. And then last but not least in honorable mentions is Butterfly in the Sky. This was a documentary about Reading Rainbow and LeVar Burton, his career, and all this stuff. I found this film to be very informative and very moving at times. There you have it, my honorable mentions. So now let's get into the first of 5 categories. And the first category is animated films have been around for literal decades, almost to the start of filmmaking in of itself. And the fact that companies nowadays seem to treat it as some sort of second-class art form is so nihilistic to me. It's so heartless to me. Whenever I see a TV show that has a great crew of animators, great voice cast, great writers that get canceled after one season. Such a shame. And then you have Warner Brothers, who literally cancels things like Scooby-Doo meets Crypto the Superdog. What the fuck, Warner Brothers? What the actual... But animation as a medium deserves to be respected, and it deserves to be analyzed because there's just so much detail you can put into animation that you can't really do in live action. When it comes to animation, it is a beautiful art form meant to evoke a lot of different emotions on a level that, in my opinion, can't really be replicated in live action. And this year sought to bring us a lot of animated films, and a lot of animated films made it onto my best list. So let's go down the list of animated films that are in this category and briefly talk about each one of them. First one up is Belle. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that this came out in 2021. It did, internationally, but because this film came out in January of 2022 in the United States, that means I could put it onto my best list of 2022. And it's a pretty good film. It's a pretty damn good film, actually. It takes the general formula and idea behind Beauty and the Beast and transitions it into a more modern day interpretation of the formula and addresses a lot of issues pertaining to social media and grief and loss and trauma and the willingness to help others in a bleak environment. There's just so much you could talk about with Belle that I'm not really going to go into it in here, but I think my favorite things from this film, obviously the animation is spectacular and the character designs are iconic, but the voice cast for the dub and the music itself are both spectacular things that really complement the film in ways that made me emotional at times. One of the big sections of the film, there's like this moment where there's this huge moment of silence, and you kind of feel the sort of weight of the scene, and it's like, it's so good that when the song picks back up from the audience, it's like, ooh, it's so good, it's so supportive. And similar to Belle, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio kind of takes the familiar idea of Pinocchio and he gives it his own twist. There's a lot of things that are original from this interpretation of Pinocchio. In a year full of Pinocchio adaptations, this one managed to be easily the best version. Its stop motion is incredible, the character designs are expressive and unique. Its, music is amazing, done by Alexander Desplat, and the general direction of the voices and the story are pretty impactful for the most part. It's a story about how we choose to live a life of selflessness versus selfishness. It's a film that addresses trauma and grief and how we can use that trauma and grief to create something beautiful and magical. And it's something that I really appreciate with this film. Marcel the Shell with Shoes On is a stop-motion animated film that I also saw this year that I felt was kind of cute. It was kind of unique. And certainly after you get past the initial premise of the film, there really isn't much else that you could really talk about with the film. But honestly, I felt that the whole thing kind of felt like a nice little slice of life sort of film that has a bit of a nice narrative angle around Marcel trying to get back his family, and it's adorable. It's an adorable little movie, and the fact that so much of it feels like it just feels real world to me, it's just amazing. Like, yeah, certainly they film this entire thing in like a house, like a real life house, and they just kind of move characters around stop motion wise, but it's just amazing to watch. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish had to be on here. Sorry, this movie is really a really good example of how you reboot a character. Like, again, I have not seen the TV show that this is kind of, leading from, but when I first saw the original Puss in Boots film, I thought it was just kind of, But for the most part, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish does a lot of things that a lot of other films should do. It's a film that addresses some core issues within the character of Puss in Boots. We see a Puss in Boots that had become arrogant of the fact that he had so many lives, that when he's down to his last one, he's truly tested as a character. And it's really amazing. Plus, you have two fantastic villains in this one. You have Jack Horner, who is this giant man baby who wants all the power, this typical villain stuff. But then you have Death, who is this giant wolf guy, and it's just amazing the detail that they're able to do with this character. Like, I didn't even know until after watching it the first time that you could see Death early on in the film, and it's just amazing. It's amazing. Plus, the animation of the action sequences, paired with some pretty good voice casting and a lot of great music, it just wraps it all up in a package that is just iconic to watch. Turning Red is also another amazing film that I saw this year, and it's such a shame that Disney, who was under Bob Chapek at the time, felt like it was a bad idea to put that in movie theaters, so they just put it on the Disney Plus for free, and just undermining the work of a lot of people. And yet, certainly, yes, it developed a fan base at home, and it was a pretty good success. But honestly, I felt like it was such a undeserving punishment towards the team who made the movie that they didn't get to see their movie on the big screen. And I hope that in the future, Disney decides to actually show these movies like, like Turning Red and Soul, and putting them on the big screen for people to see. Because honestly, when I'm watching the Turning Red and I see the scene where May's mom shows up as a giant kaiju, that would have been amazing to see the first time on a big screen. I'm just telling you. And then going off of the international scene, we have My Love Affair with Marriage. This is a very interesting movie, to say the least. I understand that some people might not appreciate a movie like this, but it's basically a story of a woman who's trying to figure out her life in pertaining to her feelings on love and marriage. and how her conceptions of marriage and her relationship with other men and women and whatnot kind of change and recontextualize over time. I really enjoyed this film, and the animation style is pretty unique for what it is, and I understand how it might not be as accessible. And as far as I know, at least, it's not accessible to anyone at this point in time, considering the fact that it hasn't released yet in the United States, except if you went to Tribeca like I did, which is unfortunate, honestly, because this is such a good film. I like the voice acting, I like the music, and I do love the character designs and the animation. It's such a unique style that it's just, I thought it was great. And if you watch the short film My Year of Dicks on Hulu, it actually kind of has an interesting pairing if you paired the two together, but that, I digress. And then we have Rise of the TMNT, or Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This, to me, is my favorite Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, because this serves as not only a continuation of the Rise television show that I really did adore, but it serves as a finale of sorts to the entire franchise. And it's kind of sad that it didn't get renewed for a third season, because I do think that with them releasing the show so soon after the 2012 show ended, it is kind of, you know, a little bit hard to go from the 2012 show to something like that and be like, oh yeah, I'm perfectly okay with this sort of whiplash of tones. But to be honest here, again, the show is just amazing, and the movie is downright almost a masterpiece. The actual, like, animation of, you know, the fight scenes and the character dynamics between all the brothers are really tested in this movie. And plus, you have Krang. Krang is a big part of that franchise, and I really did feel like these Krang are just monstrous and scary. Like, for the first time, they're like a menace in this movie. Honestly, give this movie a watch if you're a general Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fan, like I am. Like, I thought it was really great, but I know some people might not share the same opinion, so check it out for yourself and check back with me. Similar to that vein, we have The Bad Guys, which is such a fun and interesting movie to talk about. It's not necessarily going to win many awards for its originality, which is not necessarily original, but with its art style and kinetic action beats and its, you know, illustrated CG look to the movie, I love the way this thing moves. I love the physical comedy. I love the physicality of this movie. So many great sight gags, so many great comedic beats. It's just all well done, and the animators did an amazing job getting all these characters to have different personalities, aside from the way they look, but the way they move, the way they talk, the way they express themselves, all really feel unique and expressive. And I also found the movie to be quite hilarious at times, and it's a pretty fun movie for the most part. I really thought it was great. And what animation list would be complete without Henry Selick? Henry Selick returns to the screen with Wendell and Wild, which is a co-production with him and Jordan Peele about an orphan girl who goes to this school, this sort of like orphanage school thing in this town, and she calls upon demons to help resurrect her parents. Kind of a dark story if you ask me. And honestly, there's a lot of good stuff to appreciate with this movie. Like, the sister nun character has some great lines of dialogue, some great intrigue. Not much really happens with her, but she is pretty good in the movie. Kat as a character, I like Raoul. I love, you know, I love Wendell and Wild as characters, voiced by Keegan-Michael Key and Jordan Peele. They're really great. The art style and animation is just spectacular. This is Henry Selick after all, and it's pretty great. It's a pretty good movie. It does have a little bit of issues that I have here and there with, like, the narrative being a little bit kind of okay, but, like, for the most part, I found it to be a really fun and rewarding film that has some great moments and a lot of great visual language that is put out onto the screen. Horror was another category that had a lot of big intrigue this year, and a lot of really great movies that released this year as well, both independent and in the mainstream. So let's talk about my picks here. First up, The Menu. The Menu is going to be contentious with some friends of mine, and honestly, I have friends who really don't like it, but I wholeheartedly enjoyed it. This whole movie about artistic expression and how people interpret art, how people interpret food, is so interesting to me. I love the black comedy of it all. This whole aspect of, them being all these like rich people in this room, not knowing about the fact that they're going to die later, in a very hilarious menu thing. I love the fact that this film is kind of split into different, offers on the menu. So like every time they go to a new piece on the menu, they have to like explain what is in the menu, what is in this dish, and I thought it was pretty great. And it's awesome. I thought Anya Taylor-Joy did a great job. John Leguizamo is pretty decent, but Ralph Fiennes as this sort of malicious chef person is just, it's creepy. It's creepy, it's borderline sadistic, and I really like his performance. This sort of like, mysterious sort of like angry chef that's like, you guys just don't appreciate my fucking food. And I love him. I love this movie. I thought this was great. And I know that there are friends of mine who just don't like it, but to me, I thought it was a pretty great sort of thriller mystery movie that I thought it was great with its horror elements. And next up we have The Black Phone, which is adapted from a Joe Hill short story and directed by Scott Derrickson and adapted by C. Robert Cargill, and is a pretty fun little movie about a kid who just has to survive against the Strangler, or sorry, what was it? Not the Strangler, but like just like this magician guy who's like trying to, the Grabber, that's his name. He has to survive against a Grabber who has like these creepy masks that like, the masks themselves are designed really well and really get into the psyche of who the Grabber is, like internally and externally. And I really found Ethan Hawke's performance to be some of his best work. For him, it was pretty challenging considering the fact that he doesn't like to play the villain, but this was his first time playing the villain, so kudos to that. I thought the kids did an amazing job, especially the little girl sister of the main character. Such a terrific talent that I hope to see more of on screen. And apparently there was some scene in the movie where it was her idea to get hit with the belt. And I'm like, that's kind of messed up, but that's kind of okay. I don't know how best to think about that in terms of the idea, but it really is a good performance. It really is. Overall, I thought The Black Phone was pretty fun, creative, and a very simple story to tell in this time of life. I thought it was pretty great. Another horror film that I found to be fairly simple but also really disturbing is Smile. I know not a lot of people are going to be interested in this movie because, the trailer doesn't really sell it very well. But what I saw out of the movie was a movie about mental health. What I saw was a movie about the horrors of being stuck in your own mind. And as someone who routinely sometimes gets stuck in my own mind, I found it quite terrifying to like watch this movie. And it was genuinely disturbing at the end. I'm not going to get into it, by the way, but it's genuinely disturbing. And I hope that the sequel to Smile lives up to expectations, because the first Smile I found to be very evocative, emotional, and just downright scary and just psychotic. And speaking of psychotic, X and Pearl. I put these in the same sort of slot here because they do complement each other, mostly because Pearl is the prequel to X and they both came out in the same year, which is very shocking to me how quickly of a turnaround there was between X and Pearl. And both of them do complement each other pretty well. Both of them discuss the aspects of sex and media and movie making, and it's just a lot of really great things. Mia Goth as well does an amazing job playing two different roles. We have Pearl and then the main character of X, who she's going to be reappearing, I think, in Maxine. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But X and Pearl are pretty great deconstructions of, or pretty great discussions of sex and media, and it's pretty interesting to think about and to just watch and enjoy. Like, even if you're not thinking about the subtext of the films or even the text of the film, there is a lot of stuff that you can really like. If I had to pick which one I liked better, X or Pearl, personally, I like Pearl better. Pearl is such an interesting movie to me because it is a film that's supposed to give you backstory on the old lady from X, but it's such a different film. It is a completely different film that was written both by T.I. West and Mia Goth during COVID lockdown. And it makes the most sense with like, the time period that they decided to place this in, as well as the general costume design and some of the lines of dialogue that they use. Like, it takes place in 1918 during, like, the flu pandemic, and it definitely fits. But it's also a movie that is pretty fun to watch. I found myself interested in the story of Pearl wanting to be a star, but there's always something, like, kind of darker lurking behind her expression, her face, her masks that she uses. And it's pretty interesting. I thought it was really great. I think the actress who played the mother was amazing. And the 8-minute monologue that Mia Goth had to present towards the end of the movie is pretty arresting at times, because it's so creepy and it's so well delivered. I felt it was just amazing, and I'm excited to see what Maxine brings to the table to finish out the X trilogy. Next one is a bit of a contentious one, and I know one of my friends from my film club really does not like this movie, but guess what? I am making this list, so I'm putting Terrifier 2 on this list. Terrifier 2 was one of my favorite horror movies of the year, mostly because it is a great mix of black comedy and humor, but it was also this sort of weird Nightmare on Elm Street-like, horror movie with lots of dream sequences and just a lot of gore. Like, out of every movie I saw this year, this is the goriest movie I saw all year. So much so that apparently there were, like, screenings where people threw up. That's a commendable thing to have for a film like this. And this is a film made for, like, basically pennies that made, what was it, $15 million or something like that? It was a lot of money. Or even, I can't remember how much it made, but, like, it made a good handful. And for sure, we're definitely going to get a Terrifier 3, but Terrifier 2 was pretty great. I thought it was really great. All the practical effects, I thought it was horrific and gory, but also funny, because Art the Clown and the actor who plays him, very talented people. I really do appreciate the story. And on top of that, I don't think I can get the Clown Cafe theme song out of my head. Like, as I'm talking about Terrifier 2, I have the stupid Clown Cafe song in my head. It's almost annoying. And second to last on my horror category list, we have Hellraiser 2022. I think the new Hellraiser is such an interesting interpretation of the Clive Barker, like, original. I do like this new interpretation. I like the way the Cenobites look. I like the story with the main character having drug abuse issues and having to learn how to confront the issues that she's had with everything in her life. And I do love all the creature work. I love the effects work. I love the new way they use the lament configuration to be like, oh yeah, there's, like, different ways this thing configures, and if you get it to a certain point, you can make it like a wish or something. And it's quite gruesome and horrific. And this is from the same people who did The Night House, which I found was pretty visually interesting at times, and pretty just interesting overall for its psychotic thriller aesthetic. But Hellraiser was a pretty nice reinterpretation of the original source material, and I found it was pretty great. And last but not least in the horror category is a film called Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. I just saw this film not too long ago, and honestly, it's definitely one of my favorites of the year. Boasting a cast that is both funny and witty, but also kind of intense at times, it's a film that is basically Among Us if it was, much more slasher themed. I compared Bodies, Bodies, Bodies to a Gen Z version of Scream. Even though, yes, we have Scream 6 nowadays, this film, Bodies, 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 is a testament to how you could change a genre in a way, or rather twist the expectations of a genre on its head in the final 5 minutes of the film. It actually is a pretty funny and downright interesting ending when you consider it. Just all of this happening, and then that twist happens, and I'm not really going to get into what the twist is. You're just going to have to find out for yourself. The next category we have in the video is honestly the shortest out of all of them, so let's knock this one out of the way, and that is documentaries. There were a lot of documentaries out there, and unfortunately I didn't get around to seeing a lot of them, so I only have 2 that are on this list. The first one is a film called Endangered, which you can find on HBO Max. I saw this one at Tribeca, and honestly, it is very pertinent to nowadays because we have various state governments that are trying to push laws that are very much against the freedom of speech, especially freedom of the press. I mean, recently we had a whole thing happen in Tennessee, in the state capitol, where a couple of Congresspeople were shoved out or evicted from Congress, all because they stood with protesters, all because of a recent event that happened in Tennessee. I can't quite say it on YouTube because YouTube has issues, but we all know what's happening with that. It's essentially a documentary about how governments and fascists are trying to silence the freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom to criticize elected officials. It's a lot. And it's not just America that they focus on in the film. They focus on, Brazil with Bolsonaro and various other countries that are dealing with the same issues. Honestly, this is probably one of the more precedent documentaries out there, so check it out if you want to. And then the other documentary I wanted to mention was Leave No Trace. This is a documentary about the Boy Scouts of America. I am a card-carrying member of the Boy Scouts of America. In fact, in my wallet here, I have my Eagle Scout card, and this is proof. This is my cracked Eagle Scout card. I had to get a brand new one just to replace the cracked one, but having been in the Scouts, I've known about the issues at play. But this documentary really goes into detail as to how deep it really goes. Like, it goes Vatican levels of corruption and just avoiding the topics whatsoever. I find that the most infuriating thing that come out of this documentary is the fact that the Boy Scouts of America have this whole image, this whole Norman Rockwell image of classic 1950s Americana, and this whole gee shucks, we're so innocent. And yet, for 70 years, as a parent in this documentary, they've known about every single person that has ever been in the Boy Scouts of America that has been a predator, and they never report on it because they have an image to uphold, which just infuriates me. It is a very infuriating documentary for someone who was a former Boy Scout. And it also goes into other details, like the fact that there was a scout who was kicked out because he was gay. And he even elaborates on it. He says, well, I mean, the Boy Scouts are all about, avoiding predators, yet they kick out gay people like they think that they're predators, even though the real ones are the scout leaders that are trying to take advantage of the boys, which is just scary to me. Like, this whole documentary to me, as someone who was in Scouts, is scary. It's a scary documentary, and it's very honest about the issues at play. And I know for some people that I've seen on places like Facebook and other places that talk about scouting and the issues with scouting, there's so many people that are trying to come to the defense of scouting and say, oh, well, scouting is a good thing, actually, blah, 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 blah. They're trying to defend it by saying, oh, but there's good things, too. That doesn't exactly work. And see, I could talk about Leave No Trace a lot more and its effects on America, as well as, the Boy Scouts of America. But that's going to have to be for another video when I talk about a film called Follow Me Boys. But that's for way later down the line when I've done a lot more research on, because I want to actually get it right. And the next category is drama/comedy. These are films that can be categorized as either dramas or comedies or both. So starting off with Clerks 3. This, to me, is a culmination of a lot of things that Kevin Smith has done in his most recent years as a filmmaker. Ever since his heart attack, it's always kind of played a big key role in his later films in the Askew-verse. And Clerks 3 really feels like an emblematic love letter, not just to his past, but also to his fans as well. It's a film that kind of wraps a lot of story threads up from Clerks 2 into Clerks 3 in a way that I felt was very nice, actually. And the opening 3 minutes of the film are just very emblematic of this sort of free spirit that Kevin Smith is. He's a filmmaker that does what he wants, and you can't really blame him for that. He's having a lot of fun, his friends are having fun, and Clerks 3 is definitely one of my favorites of the entire trilogy, if not my favorite film from the Askew-verse. Mostly because it's just such a nice tale about two friends who are trying to make this film, which just so happens to be a story about the first movie, which is kind of fun in of itself for those who are just fans of the Askew-verse in the first place, or even Kevin Smith films, or even the Clerks series. It's a very fun and energetic movie that has a lot of heart, especially towards the end. And I'm not gonna lie, I did cry at one specific point, which I will not discuss because of spoilers, but it's pretty good. Next up is The Banshees of Inisherin. Martin McDonagh is a filmmaker that you're either gonna love or you're either gonna hate, right? In Bruges is one of those movies that's like the deepest of black comedies, and it's a pretty dark film. And the fact that Martin McDonagh gets to work with both Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson again is such a dream to those who are fans of In Bruges. And The Banshees of Inisherin is a pretty good film for the most part. It's a film about friendship. It's a film about, you know, whether or not to change one's personality in order to feel like they have to be, you know, special to someone. There's a lot of things you could read into the film, but more often than not, the main thing that I really loved about the film is Colin Farrell's performance as this character who's just trying to figure out why the hell his best friend that he's had for years is just trying to ghost him for so much of the movie. It's a really funny and dark movie that I found that was one of my favorites of the year. What drama list wouldn't be complete with a Cooper Raiff film? That's right, this past year we had Cooper Raiff return with his sophomore film Cha Cha Real Smooth. To me, while it's not necessarily as good as, say, Shithouse, which was his first film, Cha Cha Real Smooth was a pretty fine movie. It's basically about a guy who's just trying to, you know, get his rent up, he's just trying to get his money's worth, and he decides to be a DJ. He decides to be a person who hypes up different parties for people, and it's actually kind of fine. And him and his co-star Dakota Johnson, they both have a really nice chemistry together in the film. Is it perfect? No, it's a fine sophomore movie. It's a fine movie in of itself, but to me, it is pretty good. It's still good despite it not being as good as Shithouse. But I'm excited to see what Cooper Raiff has in the future for his third film. Now, to set this one up, for my birthday this past year, I was given this 16mm camera. And it's with a camera like this that a person like Steven Spielberg was able to make his films. And that's what the next film in this category is, The Fable Men. Now, some people will say, well, The Fable Men is just kind of a blah, you know, biopic, but that's not what I saw. What I saw was a story about, you know, Steven Spielberg's surrogate being this person named Sam Fableman, who is just trying to find his voice. He's just trying to find his voice in his filmmaking and what he sees around him within the filmmaking. There's so much good stuff in this film. The person they get for Sam Fableman is a really good actor. Paul Dano is great. I like the cinematography. I like the story that it presents. And the last 5 minutes with the cameo, which I'm not going to discuss for spoilers, but let's just say it was really great and pulls from a real life thing that happened to Steven Spielberg himself. And it was high time that after so many years of filmmaking, Steven decides to finally reveal behind the camera what his life was kind of like. What happened with his divorce between his parents, how that affected him, how that affected his family, how he saw it. And it's very effective at the way it is told. And honestly, I couldn't help but not like it. And of course, some people will probably say, well, Spielberg has fallen off, he's just telling his old stories, but like, can the guy just like tell his story? I mean, he's been doing filmmaking ever since the 1960s and 70s, like professionally. And it was high time at this point in time that he had to tell his story. Even if you don't think it's that great, it's his story. The next film I'm going to talk about is probably a bit of a whiplash from what I just talked about with Fablemans, but let's talk about On the Count of Three. On the Count of Three is the darkest of dark comedies I've seen this year. It is, without a doubt, a film that is basically the biggest version of Russian roulette. It's basically about two people that are at the very end of their strings, and they decide to form a pact to, well, end their life membership, as it were. But over the course of the film, both of them go through processes and they go through different events in the day that may or may not make them change their minds and their decisions. It's truly a film about appreciating life when you're the closest to death. That's probably the best I could really describe it, but it's a very interesting movie. And obviously this film is probably not going to be on a lot of people's top 10 lists, but to be honest, I found it to be entertaining, refreshing, comedic at times, darkly comedic, gallows humor and all, but I found it pretty good enough to put on this list. And in speaking of filmmaking from the Fable Men, let's talk about Babylon. Babylon is the fourth film from Damien Chazelle, who did Whiplash, La La Land, and First Man, and takes place in the early days of the silent film era as it transitions into, you know, the talkies. It's basically a different version of Singing in the Rain, and in fact the film basically ends with Singing in the Rain amid a whole kaleidoscope of just seizure-inducing images in an edit that is very overwhelming. But what I found the most interesting out of Babylon is the aspect of how films and filmmaking and being part of filmmaking kind of lends itself to being this sort of circular cycle of creativity in life, where it's, you know, yeah, by doing these things, you're part of a continual system that's going to continue to inspire more people. And it doesn't necessarily, you know, give it a nihilistic reason or any sort of other excuse. The basic question that it asks the viewer is, why do we do this? Because there is a lot of crazy things that happen in Babylon. In fact, one scene in particular with like them trying to get one shot done for like their first talkie film is some of the most hilarious things I've ever witnessed. And things like that I've experienced on sets before. And it's crazy. And there's so much trauma and strife that goes on in this movie, but the ending really asks the question, why do we do this? Why do filmmakers, artists, dancers, actors, why do all of them do this crazy shit? It's because of this. It's because of what we put out in the world. It's because of what people get to see. Throughout all of this, what is it all worth? Why do they get up every day in the morning to do this type of stuff? And it's a crazy movie. Don't get me wrong, it's a very crazy movie. It's probably the most audacious and ambitious movies that Damien Chazelle has ever done. And it's probably the longest movie he's ever done. But it's a movie that has so much drive, so much energy, so much passion put into it that I couldn't help but not put it on this list. And obviously, I'm gonna butt heads with some people who didn't like Babylon, but I did. I found it enjoyable. The second to last film that I have in my drama category is a little film from the UK called Brian and Charles. This is set in Wales, where you have Brian, who is this sort of inventor guy, and Charles is this robot that he creates to be a friend because he's so lonely. And it's through that process of building that friend of his and getting to know other people with Charles that he's able to have a community around him to basically support him amidst a bunch of people that are trying to, well, bully Brian. It's a film that I found to be very heartwarming, cheeky at times, and I found to be really funny and relatable at times. And I also want to commend the aspect of the film being this sort of pseudo-documentary sort of thing of like, yeah, we're going to follow these two interesting people and then just let the rest of the film just tell its own story. I found that to be pretty fun. It's a very unique movie that came out in 2022, and honestly, I think the year would have been missed without it. And the last film in the drama category, or the drama comedy category, is a film called Disfluency. It was one of the films that I really gravitated towards the most with Eastern Oregon Film Festival last year, and is a film that has a lot of hard topics to go into. So if you are very sensitive to discussions or imagery of, sexual violation, then this is not for you. Essentially, this movie is about a person that is trying to move on from a trauma, or trying to move past a trauma that she experienced when she was in college. Why she chose to go out of college for the term and go back home for a while. And it's a film that is pretty hard hitting. It's a pretty hard-hitting and emotional movie that has a lot of great cinematography choices and is pretty good looking. The actors do their best with the material, and even the main character, the main actress, does an amazing job communicating the fear and panic that comes from such a traumatic event that happened to her. And I think that Disfluency is one of the best films of the year because of what it describes, what it talks about, how it talks about it in terms of its language, and it's really good at discussing these things. And last but not least, let's talk about everyone's favorite subject, the blockbuster. These are films that I would categorize as things like action movies, sequels, big ideas, things that break records, things that are musicals mostly, and sometimes even things that are sci-fi adjacent. So let's talk about the blockbusters of the year, shall we? Let's talk about one of the biggest ones of the year, earning the most award nominations of all time, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I knew from the first moment that I saw this trailer, I was like, I'm sold. This trailer is, the trailer for this movie was amazing. And then when I first watched the movie, I thought it was just even more amazing. The Daniels have always had a very specific way of showcasing action and showcasing visual language in a very weird and incredibly odd way. I mean, you take a look at their filmography like Swiss Army Man or even the Turn Down for What music video, and you see that there is this continual method, this continual desire to embrace the weirdness of the world. And what could be more weird than traversing the multiverse in such a weird way? Coming up with different ways to switch your mind between different universe versions of you. Cutting between your fingers, trying to get this other version of you to get their traits. It's very interesting and odd. It has a lot of creativity that's involved in the action sequences, and the story itself is a story between optimism and pessimism and nihilism, and the bond that you can find in the center of those two sides. It's a very interesting movie about, growing up. It's an interesting story about all these things. And while yes, it's definitely a bit of a mixed bag in terms of its narrative structure, it definitely feels the most like it is emblematic of ADHD. This aspect of moving between these different multiverses and following many different storylines feels the most like what I experience on a day-to-day basis, with so many different ideas that I have for my own movies just kind of being almost everywhere, and it's not organized. But it feels the most like it in terms of its presentation, its editing, its story choices. It is really well done, and everyone does an amazing job. Obviously, Michelle Yeoh does an amazing job as the lead character, as well as Ke Huy Quan, who plays the husband in the movie. And he's an amazing actor, and it's very sad to have heard his story post Goonies and how his life, kind of just went away after Goonies and Indiana Jones. And I'm just hoping, Disney, that you give him the short round show that a lot of people really want. And Disney, I know you're watching, or maybe you're not, but in the case that you are, please give Ke Huy Quan his own short round show, please. I heard rumors that you guys had canceled that show because you wanted Lucasfilm to continue to just make Star Wars content. Please, just for all of us fans of Indiana Jones, we would love to see a story with short round. We do. There's a lot of people out there that want that. The next film on the list is Nope. This is the third film by Jordan Peele, who previously made Get Out and Us, and I thought it was a pretty fun creature feature. I thought it was a pretty fun science fiction, horror, big concept movie about the idea that you shouldn't really be embracing big spectacle while also making it a big spectacle. It's honestly a pretty interesting movie when you think about it, from everything from its symbology, its messaging, about spectacle, about the way we treat animal, actors, animal performers, animal wranglers, all these different things, while also making a film that feels the most emblematic of Jaws since fucking Jaws. Even the cinematographer basically said that the sky had to feel like the ocean, how you had to be a bit paranoid of the sky in order to really sell the effect of this giant giant space creature just sucking up everything. And it couldn't even be further from a lie. It feels like that. Also, the VFX process of this film, making the day for night shots look very nice. They really made them look very spectacular. You could see everything, and it's just beautiful. It's a beautiful looking movie. And I also felt that the third act of this movie was just the most fun that I've had in a theater almost all year. Definitely one of my favorite Jordan Peele movies, and I'm excited to see what his fourth film is, because that apparently comes out Christmas next year, so I'm excited. But if it's big spectacle that we are here to talk about, let's talk about the biggest spectacle of the year. Avatar: The Way of Water. Yes, narratively, it's not necessarily the most condensed movie ever made, but it's a movie about family and connection, and it does have its own reputation in terms of the critical reception of some of the film. But overall, the very fact that James Cameron is so detail-oriented that he had started making this movie 7 years ago, and for 7 years he's tried to make this film happen. It's just crazy. The amount of ingenuity and new ways of capturing performances, especially in the water, it's just amazing. It's just amazing. On a technical level, the CG work, the motion capture work, the entirety of this movie looks magnificent. It looks beautiful. It looks amazing. And yes, certainly, it is a bit long in the tooth. It is 3.5 hours long, although it is a bit shorter than Titanic, which I think is his longest film. I'm not quite sure. But Avatar: The Way of Water might have some issues for me, but I found it to be pretty fun and interesting at times. But is it perfect? No, but it did get the highest grossing movie of 2022 at $2.3 billion, which really wasn't that hard to get, honestly. The original film was such a cultural touchstone of the early 2000s that it was hard not to see a potential world where Avatar 2 would still win the box office, even if it didn't win as much of the box office as its original counterpart. And I know that there were conversations online that said, oh, Avatar 2 is just not going to make a lot of money because who gives a shit about the original Avatar? But because it's been part of our zeitgeist for so much of our time in the original early 2000s, and because of the new Pandora park, obviously, people really wanted to see where this world went after 2009. And we're about to get 3 more movies, so oh boy. Now on my list, I have only 2 comic book movies that I have on the Blockbuster side of things. So let's start with Marvel. I only have 1, and that is Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. This movie had an uphill battle to get through. Not only did they have to address the passing of Chadwick Boseman, but they also had to address it in a way that felt narratively poignant to the story. You know, the loss of Chadwick Boseman back in 2018, I believe, was a pretty effective thing, right? He had been in so many movies that has touched the hearts of millions, especially for the African American community. And he seemed like a pretty big guy in the world. And for Black Panther: Wakanda Forever to address the absence head on in a way that felt very thematically coherent to the story of not just to Shuri or to her mom, but to the nation of Wakanda and what that has in respect to the rest of the world. But outside of that, I loved everything that they had with Tia Khan. I love the underwater world. I love the production design of all of this stuff. The tapestries, the artwork, the clothing, just everything. It just felt very well done in terms of the characterization and personification of the world of Telecon. And then Namor as well. We finally get to have Namor in the MCU with his winged feet. I liked it. I loved it. And I hope to see more of Namor in the future. You know, it would be pretty cool to see him later on in, say, maybe Secret Wars or something. I don't know what else they have for him in the future. But obviously the biggest emotional core of this film was Letitia Wright's performance as Shuri. She has the most to do. Whereas in the original Black Panther, she was just kind of like the fun, you know, sister character who was very big into the, you know, gadgets. We now deal with a character who thought she had all the answers. She thought that she had the ability to help save her brother from this mysterious illness. But apparently she just wasn't. And she grapples with that throughout the entire film. And it's just this amazing, amazing performance throughout the entire thing of her kind of reaching to the point where she kind of accepts the responsibilities of being the Black Panther. And I thought that that was truly interesting. And I thought that was truly fun. And yes, certainly, there are some things that could have been handled better. I do think that the fight with all the Telecons at sea could have been handled maybe a little bit better strategically, but that's besides the point. I do like Ironheart. Her new suit is, yeah, everyone's memed about it. It's basically a Power Rangers looking suit, but I honestly found it to be pretty cool in terms of a color palette exchange. I thought it was pretty nice. But overall, I do think that Black Panther Wakanda Forever is a good sequel, and is probably one of the best films of the MCU in terms of Phase 4. And Phase 4 is a different discussion altogether. We're not going to get into it in today's video, but Black Panther Wakanda Forever is the best of Phase 4, and a pretty good capstone on the themes of what MCU Phase 4 was. It was a transitionary period. It was a period of trauma and loss and grief and so many other different things that you could address inside of Phase 4 thematically. But the other comic book movie that I have to mention on here is The Batman. Look, I am not the biggest fan of this new version of Batman, but I will say it is definitely the most faithful in terms of its adaptation of things like Batman Year One and telling its own story with the Riddler in such a unique and terrifying way was such a really great move by Matt Reeves and everyone that worked on the movie. Robert Pattinson is suitably recognizable in this movie, and is suitably fit for this type of movie. This is a movie about Batman, just the Batman, and obviously at this point in his career he wouldn't be able to use the Bruce Wayne persona like we know from the comics. This is year 2 Batman, you know? He hasn't had that figured out yet. But it's a pretty interesting movie, but it does have some issues in the third act that I feel like, you know, I feel like it's a bit overblown in the third act, but that's just my opinion. I do think Paul Dano does an amazing job with Riddler. Such an interesting and unique personification of the character outside of what Jim Carrey brought to the stage, what the original Riddler from the Batman TV show brought to the stage, what the Riddler from the animated series brought to the stage. It's so different than any other version, and I thought it was pretty great. Not my favorite Batman interpretation, but it was one of the best looking films. It was one of the best shot films. It had a lot of really great sound effects and sound mixing that made the Batman feel imposing. And the score by Michael Giacchino is just great. I found it to be epic and gothic and just what I would want from the sound of Batman. But moving on from things such as the comic books, why don't we take a look at real life? Or rather, the military. Top Gun Maverick was a sequel to a movie from the 80s that, in all honesty, the original Top Gun is not a great movie. Like, plot-wise, it's just very blasé. It's very one-note. You don't know who you're fighting. Like, a lot of it doesn't really have much of a story. There's not much character going on. It's basically a puff piece for the US Air Force back then. And, well, Top Gun Maverick is a similar situation, but not as much. But to me, Top Gun Maverick improves over the original Top Gun in a lot of key areas, including which it gives characters. It actually has characters involved. Like, all these characters were pretty unique and substantial, but we also got to see much more of a different side to the main character. We got to see a different side to Tom Cruise's character. And when we get to have that scene with Iceman, once again played by Val Kilmer, it's such an effective scene. The subtleness and the undertone of that scene was very impactful, especially when you know the context of who Val Kilmer is and what happened to him and why he doesn't speak much in that scene. When he actually gets to speak in the film, it is very, very emotional to me. It is a very poignant line, and they made the best use for Val Kilmer in the way that they could in this movie. Aside from that, the practicalness of this movie, the amount of stuff that they did to make this movie happen with the different fighter jets that the cast had to train with to be able to not only shoot with the camera, but also pilot the damn airplane. Like, it is crazy the amount of preparation that the actors had to go through to be able to fly these planes for real. And when we get down to it, it is a really well edited movie in terms of its soundscape, in terms of the action beats. Every time we get to a flying sequence, it's always fun and energetic and thrilling. And it's more than I could say from the original Top Gun. This Top Gun really made you feel like you were behind the cockpit of one of these fighter jets, and it's crazy. It does have a similar issue that I have with the original Top Gun, where you still don't know who the enemy is, but it's crazy, it's nice. It's basically the Cars 3 of the Top Gun universe. I mean, really think about it for a second. Tom Cruise in the movie is an aging, fighter pilot whose program, the Top Gun program, is slowly being phased out for drones, being phased out for other things. And then you have Cars 3, where it's basically Lightning McQueen. He's an aging car and has to train a new person eventually. I mean, that's just my argument anyway, but feel free to disagree with me in the comments. This year also saw the return of a notable mystery franchise that started all the way back in, I think, 2017, I believe, and that was Glass Onion. Glass Onion is a sequel to Knives Out that really kind of plays it safe in some areas, but it was a film that really had the whole aspect of coronavirus as part of the whole movie. How coronavirus has affected all these different people that are part of this mystery. I found all the characters to be very unique and very entertaining. I found Mary J. Blige to be a pretty effective actress, especially in her dual role in this film. I found, Daniel Craig, once again, playing the enigmatic Blanc, to be a pretty great character. I love his witty banter. I love his deduction. I love his character. And Rian Johnson, once again, delivers a mystery that, while not as good, in my opinion, as the first Knives Out movie, Glass Onion is a mystery in of itself to be kind of peeled back, like an onion. And I found it to be very engrossing and intelligent at times, but also pretty fun to watch. It's a fun murder mystery on an island full of rich people. What more could you want? Another returning franchise this year, albeit under a different name, is Prey. Prey is a movie that I really fell in love with. It was a movie that takes us back to an era in the Predator timeline where the Predator is not as technologically advanced as his later counterparts would be in the franchise. But this one felt like a pretty fun action horror movie. The whole scene with the Predator taking apart all the people in the French encampment was really fun to watch. And the final fight between Amber Midthunder's character and the Predator is really fun and harkens back to the original Predator, getting back down to the basic roots of what makes a Predator film work. And honestly, if they could do more of this type of movie, that would be amazing. Imagine a samurai version of this movie. Imagine a Viking version of this movie. Just have the Predator go up against different cultures in this whole new anthology way of telling stories. That would be amazing. And one other notable thing about this film is that not only did they have this film, have just, the regular English voice track, but they also added, in addition, a Comanche dub, which I thought was very unique and very awesome. And it is one of the first blockbusters to have a indigenous actress at the forefront of a major franchise, which is pretty blockbustery if you really think about it, not just because it's a Predator film, but it broke new ground socially. And hopefully we get to see more of Amber Midthunder and everyone else that worked on this movie, because I thought it was really great. Very fun, very inviting, and very cool. And the last blockbuster in this category, in this last category of the video, is a film, a musical, a war film, a drama, a romance, a comedy. It's a lot of different genres, harkening from the Tollywood section of India, the Telugu film RRR. This is a film that when I first watched it, I could not take my eyes off of it. Every time that I watch this movie, it is a rush of adrenaline. There is so much happening in this movie. There is a love subplot. There is a revenge subplot. There is a war subplot. There is music in this. It's a musical as well. It is really great. And the music was so great that it took home many Best Original Song awards in the United States and abroad. Natu Natu is one of my favorite songs of the entire soundtrack, and how could it not be? It's very catchy, it's very great, and the scene that accompanies it is one of the most energetic musical scenes that I've seen in recent memory. Not only that, but the action in this film is suitably over the top, and it's really fun to watch. It's a really fun movie that has so much creativity and so much fun, and it just takes itself not too seriously, but seriously enough that you can get as invested as the film is with not only the characters, but the world around them. And there you have it, my best films of 2022 list. If there's anything that I could do in the next video, in the next version of this video, the best films of 2023, put those suggestions down in the comment section down below. And if there's any films that I didn't mention in this video that you think I should watch, put them down in the comment section down below. And I can also write them on my Letterboxd page, which I will link in the description, my list of the films that I would rank from best to worst from 2022. It is a pretty long list. I've watched over 120 movies, so yeah, I'll link that in the description down below. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys have a very pleasant Easter or Passover or whatever holiday you're celebrating this weekend. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.